I'm Aaron Maté sitting in for Jimmy Dore, and here is the announcement from Russian President Vladimir Putin telling the Russian assembly that the Kremlin will suspend cooperation, or limit cooperation, I should say, with something called New START. And New START is the last remaining treaty that caps the nuclear weapon stockpiles of the U.S. and Russia. It's set to expire in February 2026. I believe. I will double check that while we're playing this clip, but it's set to expire, and Putin is saying that Russia is going to reduce its compliance with that treaty.
They can't be stupid people. They want to deliver us a strategic defeat while sneaking into our strategic nuclear objectives. Regarding this, I have to say that Russia suspends its participation in the New START treaty. Let me repeat, Russia does not abandon the treaty, but suspends its participation in it. Before resuming the discussion about this treaty, we must first understand what do such countries of the North Atlantic Alliance as France and Great Britain aspire to, and how will we take their strategic nuclear arsenals into account.
So that's Putin making that announcement. Now, what he said has been misinterpreted. So Russia is not pulling out from the treaty. It's just reducing its compliance with it. So that means that if the U.S. wants to come in and inspect Russian nuclear facilities, Russia will not let them in. But Russia still will respect the caps on nuclear weapons. So it's not going to go over those caps. And it's also going to alert the U.S. if it tests, if it carries out nuclear tests. So Russia will still comply with those aspects of the treaty, but will reduce its compliance with others. But this is very dangerous because this is the last remaining treaty that limits the nuclear weapon stockpiles of the U.S. and Russia. And if it expires, then there'll be no more limits, and we'll have an even worse arms race than we currently have. And Russia reducing its compliance makes a renewal less likely, because right now, especially with the Ukraine proxy war going on, there's no negotiations happening between the U.S. and Russia. So here's the response from President Biden. He says, according to NBC News, President Biden strongly condemned Russian President Vladimir Putin for pulling out of New START, a key arms control treaty between the world's two largest nuclear powers. And here is Biden with that sharp condemnation. Watch what he says.
Mr. President, any reaction to Putin saying he's pulling out of New START?
I don't have time.
Yeah, exactly. I don't have time. I don't have time to react. I don't have time to react to Putin reducing compliance with the most important nuclear treaty in the world.
Wow, that really puts into perspective George W. Bush finishing that kid story after 9/11.
But Biden came to his senses, and look, he managed to come up with something. Here, this is what he said. Big mistake. All right. Thank you, Biden. Thank you so much.
What's on his head? Is that a Catholic thing? Is that like Ash Wednesday or something? Or does he just have a thing on his head?
I think that's just his hair.
No, in the middle of his forehead. Am I crazy?
Oh.
No, it's something.
Yeah, it's something. You're right.
It looks like when you get Ash Wednesday.
Or
I hope that's what
bruise?
it is.
Maybe a bruise or a...
Oh, is that from falling down the fourth step? No one knows who the mysterious guy who fell is. We only can guess.
Here is more from Biden.
We watched your speech here in Warsaw, and as you know, just hours before, Vladimir Putin gave his own speech. And I wanted to ask you about something Vladimir Putin said. He said that Russia is suspending participation, cooperation in the nuclear treaty with the United States. What's your message to Putin on that?
It's a big mistake to do that, not very responsible. And but I don't read into that he's thinking of using nuclear weapons or anything like that. I think it's I'm not sure what else he was able to say in his speech at the moment, but I think it's a mistake, and
You think maybe if the president of Russia is announcing he's reducing compliance with the most important nuclear treaty in the world, that the president should know more about that, should be more updated about it before he speaks to the media? He's like, I don't really know what he said. I'm not sure.
He does, yeah. Well, he doesn't think he'll do. Listen, we're gonna play chicken. any movement on anything nuclear is not like. It is less crazy than what I thought. From what I initially heard was they're pulling out of a treaty.
Yeah,
until you just now said.
Yeah.
So like, okay, that makes more sense. But still, any movement is terrifying on anything nuclear.
Not good. It is not good.
Hopefully we'll be able to work it out.
He is saying he's going to suspend participation in this nuclear treaty. Rhetoric is one thing, but we're a year into this war now. Does it concern you when he says something like this, and are we less safe?
Well, look, I think we're less safe when we walk away from arms control agreements that are very much in both parties' interest and the world's interest. But I've not seen anything, we've not seen anything where there's a change in his posture, what they're doing. The idea that somehow this means they're thinking of using nuclear weapons, international continental ballistic missiles, there's no evidence of that.
So basically, Biden's message here is he wants us to be assured because there's no indication that Russia is more likely to use nuclear weapons right now. Okay, we're supposed to see this as a positive thing because Russia's not threatening nuclear weapons right now. Okay, great. But the question is, what does Biden have to say about the possibility that the last remaining treaty limiting the nuclear weapon stockpiles of the two top nuclear powers is in further jeopardy? He has nothing to say there really about that. He's just saying, don't worry about it for now because Putin's not going to use nuclear weapons.
You know what sticks out about it is normally anything Putin said, they would say this is the craziest thing any human's ever done or said. But now that it's getting serious because there's nuke stuff, nuke talk, now he almost sounds like reasonable. He's not going to use the nukes. They have to calm down on the worst man in the world rhetoric on it to, I guess, soothe you if you like maybe I'm not ready for a nuclear war to save the borders of Ukraine.
Yeah,
well,
changing his tune.
You remember a few months ago when Biden said that we're closer than ever to Armageddon since the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he recognizes how dangerous this moment is. He
meant for Ukraine.
Well, here's Jens Stoltenberg. He's the Secretary General of NATO, and this is what he had to say.
I regret today's decision by Russia to suspend its participation in the New START treaty. Over the last years, Russia has violated and walked away from key arms control agreements. With today's decision on New START, the whole arms control architecture has been dismantled.
So keep in mind what he just said there. Russia over the years has walked away from key arms control agreements, and with Russia now limiting its compliance with New START, now the whole architecture, he says, of arms control has been dismantled. Let's look at the actual architecture of arms control over the last 20 years and who has dismantled it. There's a pretty clear record. It's not even close. So this is a headline from 2001 from the New York Times. Bush pulls out of ABM treaty. Putin calls move a mistake.
I remember that.
Yeah, that's the anti-ballistic missile treaty, a really important treaty reached in 1972 that not only reduced tensions in the Cold War, but set the stage for more arms control agreements. What happened to those arms control agreements? Well, first of all, here's what Bush pulling out of that treaty did. This is from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a headline a few years ago. The U.S. exit from the anti-ballistic missile treaty has fueled a new arms race. That's correct.
So we helped the economy? Thank you.
So the U.S. pulled out of that treaty. And then there was another treaty called the INF Treaty, reached under Reagan and Gorbachev in the 1980s. And that eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. And guess what happened to that one?
Which nuclear weapons? Is that the thing for those, that Tsar Bomba that was like a crazy, is that for the crazy big one?
That was for intermediate range weapons. And it took them out. It was a really important treaty and it kept the peace. It was a major landmark in the Cold War, in ending the Cold War. And by the way, a major reason why it came about is because you had a huge movement in the 1980s against nuclear war. In 1982, 1 million people went to Central Park rallying against nuclear war and calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons.
Got to people that long
ago. And so the INF Treaty happened in the 1980s. And guess what happened to that one? This is a headline from 2018. Trump says U.S. is ending decades-old nuclear arms treaty with Russia. And that is the INF Treaty they're talking about. Here's another headline from that period. Trump says U.S. will withdraw from nuclear arms treaty with Russia. Experts warn of most severe crisis in nuclear arms control since the 1980s as Trump confirms U.S. will leave INF agreement. So Jens Stoltenberg somehow claims that Russia's been pulling out of arms control treaties and that Russia is now dismantling the architecture for arms control, when meanwhile it's the U.S. that's been pulling out successfully of every important
Trump only did that because Putin told him to. You know how it works.
Well, this was Putin's actual response. So yes, during that period, when Russiagators in blue and on that dominate our media and Congress are fantasizing about a Trump-Russia conspiracy, this is what Russia was actually saying about Trump and what he was doing. Russia's Putin accuses U.S., and that's Trump, of raising risk of nuclear war. That's a headline from December 2018, the height of
Russia's? Like, is there somebody else's Putin that was going to do that?
and here's the first lead of that article. Russian President Vladimir Putin accused the U.S. of raising the risk of nuclear war by threatening to spurn a key arms control treaty and refusing to hold talks about another pact that expires soon. And by the way, that other pact he's talking about, so when he says
this one,
so yeah, he's talking about this one, New START. So so the first one, he says, by threatening to spurn a key arms control treaty, that's the INF treaty, which Trump killed. He formally withdrew in 2019, a year after this. Okay, so that's the INF treaty. But then when Putin is criticizing Trump for refusing to hold talks about another pact, that's New START, because New START was supposed to expire at the end of Trump's first term. And Trump, while his opponents were calling him a Russian agent, was basically saying, I don't care about this nuclear arms treaty. We're going to let it expire. And Biden, when he came in office, one of the few positive things he did was expanded that treaty. He renewed that treaty. So that's why it expires in a few years. But now, with the Ukraine proxy war and relations between the U.S. and Russia never being worse, there's a very small chance that will be renewed. And this is because Trump was pulling out of all these arms control treaties. That led to headlines like this in Vox: the end of arms control as we know it. The last agreement limiting America and Russia's nuclear arsenals is months away from expiring. And that was the end of the Trump administration, when Trump was about to let New START expire until Biden renewed it.
Jesus, look at Trump. He looks like he's in a minstrel show. How much orange did he put on his...
So that's the actual background to arms control. And that's one of the reasons why New START is now in danger, is because there's been a rollback of all these other arms control agreements by the U.S. And this is how corporate media, though, is covering Putin's announcement. This is retired General Barry McCaffrey on MSNBC.
Oh, it's serious. It's the last piece of the architecture of control of nuclear weapons that remained. I worked on the original START treaty with the Russians. The Obama administration managed to get them to agree to freezing nuclear warhead to 1,550 and launchers to 700. It was an important piece of this. If you could verify the situation in Russia, which we finally could not. So look, I've dealt with the Russians on nuke arms control in closed offices with no one else listening in. I've never heard more dangerous, irresponsible, shameful, stupid language in my entire life than coming out of Putin and his Duma and the Russian state TV, threatening nuclear attack on Berlin, Paris, London, D.C., washing tsunamis over all of Great Britain from nuclear torpedoes. It's completely asinine. It makes no military sense whatsoever. It's hard to imagine any outcome occurring with a strategic nuclear exchange that doesn't evaporate Russia. Why are they doing this? Putin's desperate. He's not thinking logically.
So that's the picture we're getting from corporate media, that this is all Putin's fault. And the background of the U.S. systematically dismantling all these other arms control treaties is not mentioned. You will not find that mentioned anywhere in establishment media.
Okay, so when we pull it, so Russia, they're not going to let people inspect or whatever. Is that what were we pulling out of? Like, what aspect of it?
Well, already there was a dispute about that because of COVID, suspensions were already because of COVID, inspections were already suspended.
So we had inspectors making sure we were doing it too. Is that what it was?
Yeah. Well, both countries were sending in inspectors to the other countries' nuclear sites, but then because of COVID, that was suspended. And then when the Ukraine proxy war broke out, they were also like, all contact was basically paused. And then Russia accused the U.S. of blocking Russian inspectors because of U.S. sanctions on Russia. The U.S. denied that allegation, but they've both been trading allegations there.
So I mean, this is the other thing that's weird. Like, great, you got a treaty and they're down to 1,550 rockets and 700 launchers. Like, great, we got down to another number that could kill us 10 times over. Like,
yeah.
Like,
well, yes.
I don't see why any of this fucking matters. Like, you're dead either way because they're not ending it. They just reduce it to what? Like,
yeah, it's true.
What is the point?
Listen, there should be, of course, New START is not the answer. There should be even way more arms control treaties. We should be, I think, reducing nuclear weapons to zero. But the point is, things are so bad that even this really weak deal is in jeopardy now. That's how dangerous things are. Even this really weak deal that doesn't nearly offer the protection to the world that the world needs, even that's in danger now because of relations are so bad. So I wrote this article at my Substack, maté.substack.com, and it's called this. It says, with last nuclear treaty threatened, a neocon-driven nightmare advances. And what I'm putting out here is that this threat to New START and to all arms control is really the dream of neocons like John Bolton. And so here's what I wrote. The U.S. assault on arms control began under George W. Bush when John Bolton, as Undersecretary for Arms Control, withdrew the U.S. from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Bolton was determined to use his post to undermine what he has mocked as the Church of Arms Control. He was making fun of. Okay,
he's so dogmatic about we shouldn't have a lot of nukes.
That's the church. So, and Bush, who was then attempting to placate Putin by claiming to have peered into his soul, presented the ABM withdrawal as a gesture of friendship, closing the chapter on Cold War antipathy. It's a piece of paper that's codified in a relationship that no longer exists. It codified a hateful relationship, and now we've got a friendly relationship, Bush declared.
Yeah, why do you need guarantees? Because we're all friends now.
Exactly. We're friends, so we don't need a treaty anymore. Yeah.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the Russians took a different view, warning that scuttling the ABM would threaten, quote, the entire framework of international security. Their fears were confirmed when Bush and his successors built new missile bases in Romania and Poland.
Yeah,
and
you're welcome.
A gesture of friendship, right?
Yeah, the good people are by you, and your property value probably goes up.
So the Bush and then Obama continued this too, built up these new missile sites in Romania and Poland.
Wait, so you think that it's not different when we do it? That's what you're trying to say.
The U.S. claims that these sites in Romania and Poland are solely for defensive purposes, installing interceptor missiles that could protect Europe from Iran or North Korea. Never mind that Iran, a non-nuclear power, has no capacity to hit Europe, and that North Korea, which does have nuclear weapons, would be inviting instant destruction if it ever tried.
They're not just going to preemptively shoot one into LA like how they've been saying?
I don't think so, no. Unlikely. The real aim of these sites in Romania and Poland is to give the U.S. the capacity to strike Russia. Both the Poland and Romania bases are equipped with Mk-41 missile launchers, which are designed to knock out incoming rockets. But these Mk-41s can also easily be repurposed with Tomahawk missiles. So yes, the U.S. says, look, these sites in Romania and Poland, they're only defensive because we only have these defensive systems installed. What they leave out, though, is that basically within a day or two, they can repurpose these missiles to give them offensive capability.
So the best of both worlds. Why do you complain so much?
As the New York Times noted days before Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, independent experts have concurred with the Russian view that the Mk-41 launchers installed in Poland and Romania can fire not only defensive interceptors, but also offensive missiles. The Polish site, the Times added, is only about 100 miles from Russian territory and barely 800 miles from Moscow itself.
Wow. This sounds a lot like Victoria Nuland explaining we have biolabs, but not biological weapons labs in Ukraine.
Exactly. Yes, it's similar. And look, this issue is one of the many grievances that Russia put to the U.S. in December 2021, just a few months before it invaded, when it submitted these draft treaties to the U.S. and NATO to try to get them to address Russian concerns about things like the U.S. having offensive weapon systems just 800 miles from Moscow. And Russia,
good launchers make good neighbors. You never heard that?
Well, that's the U.S. view, because the U.S. basically refused to negotiate with Russia on any of these issues. So Russia wanted guarantees about these missile sites. They wanted them removed. They wanted the U.S. to not expand NATO to Ukraine. And on all those core issues, the U.S. refused to budge. They refused to even discuss them. They gave ground on a few things. They said, okay, we can talk about mutual withdrawals of some systems, but on these core issues, the U.S. and NATO basically told Russia to take a hike, and Russia responded 2 months later by invading Ukraine. And here's someone who does not agree with the Biden administration and Trump administration and Obama administration. This is William Perry, who served as the defense secretary under Clinton. And this is what he said. So William Perry, a defense secretary under Bill Clinton, saw the expansion of the anti-missile defense system in Europe as a major provocation. He said this: we rationalize the system as being to defend against an Iranian nuclear missile. They don't have any, but that's another issue, Perry said in 2016. But the Russians said, wait a bit. This weakens our deterrence. The issue, again, wasn't discussed on the basis of its merits. It was just, who cares about what Russia thinks? We dismissed it again. Yeah.
We run the world.
Exactly right. Yeah. And all this is to the glee of people like John Bolton, who said this. In February 2017, so 6 years ago, almost to the day, veteran neocon John Bolton laid out his top priority for U.S.-Russia relations. The next step in the bilateral relationship with Russia, Bolton told CPAC, is for this administration, the Trump administration, to abrogate the New START treaty. That would be a signal to Vladimir Putin.
What does abrogate mean again?
It means kill it. Like pull out of it.
Well, the signal to him to what?
That we're, we don't mess around like that, that we run the world.
I thought this was that we're really great friends.
6 years later, almost to the day, Bolton's signal was closer than ever to reality. So because the neocon agenda of people like John Bolton has completely taken over U.S. foreign policy, there's no difference between Biden and his principles and John Bolton. This now is the agenda that is driving our government. And let's go back to Russiagate, because remember, during the time of Russiagate, when Trump was pulling out all these arms control treaties, rather than focus on that, Blue Anon, which is basically all of cable news and most Democrats in Congress, were obsessively thinking that Trump was a Russian agent. And so because they had that conspiracy theory, they were de-incentivized from focusing on Trump's actual policies. Because if they were to focus on Trump's actual policies, they would have seen, oh, wait, this guy's not a Russian agent. He's actually dangerously escalating tensions with Russia by doing things such as killing vital arms control. So when Trump did kill things like the INF Treaty, this is how people like Chris Hayes covered it. Watch if you can catch him even mention it. He says it in passing.
Today, National Security Advisor John Bolton took an interesting approach to Russian interference in the presidential election. While in Moscow to discuss U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear weapons treaty, he told the Russian...
See how fast he said that? While in Moscow to discuss U.S. withdrawal from this, it's like he's burying that. That's not even news. He's not even covering that. He's just mentioning it in passing.
Well, but they interfere with our election, so it's right to threaten nuclear war. That's interference.
That's exactly their mentality.
Stop interfering.
Radio station, quote, "The point I made to Russian colleagues today was that I didn't think whatever they had done in terms of meddling in the 2016 election, that they had any effect on it. But what they have had an effect on the U.S. is to sow enormous distrust of Russia."
So that's what Blue Anon pundits are focused on, not Trump killing a vital arms control treaty and making the world more dangerous. What they can do to advance their conspiracy theory that Trump is an actual Russian asset.
It almost sounds like it's on purpose as a distraction from this thing.
And here is Adam Schiff. So just as Trump was pulling out of the INF Treaty and setting off basically a dangerous new escalation of the Cold War, the new Cold War, Adam Schiff was saying stuff like this. And they're talking about, him and Rachel Maddow are talking about the indictment of an accountant who works for a Russian troll farm that put out those dumb social media ads that nobody saw and that weren't about the election. This is them.
That John Bolton, with that newly unsealed indictment, would have to bring it up, would have to confront the Russians about this. He couldn't not. Again, the common wisdom is wrong. I feel like I'm watching an incredibly dramatic situation here, teed up by the Justice Department and blown off by the White House. How do you see it?
I see it much the same way. It's really breathtaking. When the ink was barely dry on the latest indictment of a Russian working for an oligarch, as you say, close to Putin,
he's literally talking about a bookkeeper who works for the troll farm that put out those dumb social media ads that nobody saw. And that's what they're focused on. And this bookkeeper was accused of somehow mismanaging or falsifying some numbers or hiding them being a part of some election conspiracy. It made no sense. And actually all these cases were dropped because they were so ridiculous. But that doesn't matter because they're important to the narrative of Blue Anon, which is that Russia brainwashed millions of Americans into voting for Donald Trump through their social media ads. And that's what people like Adam Schiff has to focus on. And watch what he has to say about Trump and Putin.
Have this spectacle of the National Security Advisor of the United States basically telling his counterparts, that interference you did in the last election, I don't really think it did very much. Basically communicating to Putin. Putin has to walk away from this thinking, this weak U.S. president will never confront me. He doesn't have the guts to confront me. This National Security Advisor certainly doesn't. I have essentially carte blanche in the midterms. As long as what I do helps the president's party, he will not only not call me out, he may be grateful for it. That's basically the message that John Bolton delivered. And it is so damaging to the national interest. It's breathtaking.
That John Bolton, with that.
Why is it in our national interest for Russia to feel like we're going to beat them up at any moment? Like, I don't understand how did that start? The thing with George Bush, like the neocons are like, hey, we got to like hammer Russia. Like, when did that start up?
They want to threaten Russia, and the way to do that is surround it with weapons.
Was this after Yeltsin?
This was right after Yeltsin, yeah.
So during Yeltsin, there was anything like, because I remember like...
Well, no, during Yeltsin, they're expanding NATO to Russia's borders. After the U.S. told the Soviet Union that we're not going to expand NATO 1 inch to the east, when Yeltsin comes into power, they say to him, actually, sorry, we didn't
sign anything.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's Yeltsin. So they expand NATO to Russia's borders. And because NATO expands, that gives the U.S. more places to put its weapon systems, which is why the U.S. then pulls out of the ABM treaty. And Schiff there, he says that, Bolton's sending a message to Moscow that you can go ahead and interfere in our elections. The actual message that Bolton was sending, the reason why he was in Russia on that day the Schiff is talking here, which Chris Hayes mentioned in passing, was Bolton there to discuss pulling out of the INF Treaty. So while Bolton is there pulling out of this vital nuclear arms pact, setting off a huge escalation, these people are focusing on a indictment of a Russian troll farmer and calling Trump weak in the face of Putin, and that saying that Putin must feel that Trump is weak, he can do whatever he wants. When in reality, Putin is warning, along with the rest of the Russian government, that the U.S. is escalating the new Cold War by making the threat of nuclear proliferation more likely. And these people can't focus on that because that undermines their conspiracy theory. And now they and John Bolton have gotten what they wanted. The new Cold War between the U.S. and Russia is even more dangerous as the last treaty limiting our nuclear weapon stockpiles is in danger.
Doing live stand-up comedy in Tempe, Palm Springs, Milwaukee, Nashville, Northampton, Massachusetts, Syracuse, Cohoes, New York, and Hartford, Connecticut. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets and become a premium member. Get access to all our content.